For 23 years. But your father did. For 23 years, you never saw me. But your father did. And now, you're finally gonna understand why.
The old mansion had never been so quiet. Not during the Billionaire'S lavish parties. Not during the boardroom celebrations. Not even during the funeral. Yet on this cold autumn morning, every member of the Blackwell family stood frozen in silence. A steel vault door hidden behind a library wall slowly creaked open. The sound echoed through the mansion like thunder. And standing in front of it was the one person nobody expected. The maid. A woman they had mocked, ignored, humiliated, for more than 20 years. In her trembling hand was a small brass key. The Billionaire's children stared at her in disbelief. Because according to their father's lawyers, nobody in the world should have possessed that key. Yet somehow she did. And what waited inside that vault was about to destroy everything they thought belonged to them. How could a servant hold the secret that a billionaire had hidden from his own family? And why had he trusted her more than his own blood? To understand the answer, we must go back many years. Back to a cold November morning in 1994. Back to the very day Clara Mitchell first walked through those iron front gates with 2 battered suitcases, a borrowed winter coat, and a heart so heavy with grief she could barely lift her eyes off the ground. This story is based on real events. In 1927, a German immigrant named Rosa worked faithfully for a wealthy American shipbuilder for 30 years. When her employer died at the age of 89, he passed his entire estate not to his family, but to his maid. The family contested. They lost. Because what he wrote in those final documents was undeniable. What follows is inspired by that true event. The names and details have been changed. But the truth at the heart of this story? That is completely real. People often believe wealth reveals character. But sometimes wealth only reveals greed. For decades, billionaire Charles Blackwell built an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. His face appeared on magazine covers. His name was attached to buildings across 3 states. His companies dominated real estate, shipping, and private equity. His family lived in a world most people only dream about. Behind the gates of Blackwell Manor, however, another story was quietly unfolding. A story that would take 23 years to reach its conclusion. The story of a quiet, dignified woman named Clara Mitchell. Every single day, Clara cleaned rooms nobody thanked her for cleaning. She prepared meals she was never invited to enjoy. She witnessed conversations nobody believed she was intelligent enough to understand. The Blackwell family treated her like furniture. Present. Useful. Invisible. Yet unknown to every single one of them, Charles Blackwell was watching. Watching every insult. Every cold dismissal, every cruel joke made at her expense. And long before his death, he made a decision that would shake his family to their very core. A decision locked behind a single small key. 23 years before that autumn morning in the library, Clara Mitchell arrived at Blackwell Manor on a Thursday. She was 41 years old. The cold air smelled of pine needles and frost. She remembers standing at the iron gates, staring up at a house so large it looked like something from a different world. She had grown up in a small town in rural Kentucky. Her father worked the railroad. Her mother cleaned houses, too. You could say service was in her blood. But Clara had not always lived this way. For 15 years, she had been a wife, a mother, a homemaker in the truest sense of the word. Then, in the spring of 1992, her husband James was killed in a construction accident. He was 44 years old. The scaffolding gave way on a Tuesday morning. He never made it home that evening. Clara was left with 2 children, a mortgage she could barely afford, and a grief so enormous she sometimes forgot to breathe. She had no college degree, no formal training beyond what her mother had taught her. But she had her hands, her discipline, and an unshakable sense of dignity. When the position opened at Blackwell Manor, she applied not out of ambition, but out of necessity. And she got the job. Before we continue, let's take a moment to like this video so that it can get to more people who like true life stories like this. Kindly do well to hit the subscribe button as this encourages us to create more amazing stories for you, and also tell us where you are watching from. We'd love to hear from you. The Blackwell children were young adults when Clara arrived. Charles's eldest son, Derek, was 28. His daughter, Vanessa, was 25. And the youngest, Tyler, was 22. All three had been raised in a world of private schools, overseas vacations, and designer everything. To them, the world existed to serve their needs. Staff were not people. Staff were appliances. If Clara polished a silver serving tray to a perfect shine, nobody noticed. If a single fingerprint remained on the surface of a wine glass, Vanessa would summon her with a sharp clap of her hands. Clara learned quickly to absorb the humiliation without showing it on her face. She learned to say yes, Mrs. Blackwell, and yes, Mr. Blackwell, and I apologize, I'll fix it immediately. She learned to make herself small. But inside, she was anything but small. Years passed. The insults accumulated like dust in a forgotten room. Tyler once mocked her accent at a dinner party in front of 12 guests. He called it charming in a way that made everyone laugh and left Clara standing at the edge of the dining room holding a serving tray, her face completely still, her hands trembling. Vanessa once told a friend on the phone, loud enough for Clara to hear through the kitchen door, that the help these days simply doesn't understand their place. Derek was different only in the sense that he was colder. He rarely insulted her directly. He simply looked through her, as if she were made of glass, as if she had no interior life at all. And perhaps that was the cruelest thing of all. Not the mockery, but the erasure. Yet Clara endured. Not because she lacked dignity, not because she had no options, but because she had made herself a quiet promise the morning she accepted that job. She would not let their smallness make her small. She would not become bitter. She would show up every single day and she would be excellent. Not for them, for herself. Meanwhile, Charles Blackwell was watching things that his children never imagined he noticed. He was a man who had built a business empire from nearly nothing. His own father had been a dock worker in Baltimore. Charles remembered wearing shoes with cardboard soles when he was 9 years old. He remembered what it felt like to be looked through. And somewhere along the way, after the money came and the mansions followed and the magazine profiles were written, he had watched his children become exactly the kind of people he had once despised. He said nothing. For years, he said nothing. He focused on business. He focused on growth. He told himself that wealth would mature them. It did not. What it did was make them certain. And certainty, in people who have never truly suffered, is one of the most dangerous things in the world. But there was one person in that house who reminded Charles of something he had almost forgotten. The quiet maid who showed up at 6 in the morning regardless of weather. Who never complained. Who treated every room she cleaned as if it were her own home. Whose voice, when she occasionally spoke to him directly, carried something he recognized. Steadiness. Integrity. The kind that cannot be bought. The night that changed everything happened in February of 2009. A violent storm rolled in from the northeast. Lightning shattered a power transformer 2 blocks from the estate. The entire neighborhood went dark within minutes. Rain hammered the windows. The oak trees in the garden bent nearly sideways in the wind. Most of the Blackwell family had already left that evening. Derek was at a charity gala downtown. Vanessa had flown to New York the day before. Tyler was at a friend's house. Only 2 people remained inside Blackwell Manor that night. Charles and Clara. Clara had stayed late because the storm had blocked traffic and she was waiting for conditions to ease before driving home. She was in the kitchen, sitting alone at the servants' table with a cup of tea, listening to the rain against the window. That was when she heard the sound. A heavy thud. Somewhere near the grand staircase. Then silence. She found him at the bottom of the stairs. He had collapsed near the second step. His face was pale and damp with perspiration. His breathing was shallow and irregular. Clara did not panic. She knelt beside him immediately, checked his pulse, loosened his collar. She had taken a first aid course at the local community center years earlier, after James died, because she had promised herself she would never feel helpless again. She called emergency services. She kept him talking in the minutes that followed, her voice steady and calm, her hand wrapped around his. She stayed by his side until the paramedics arrived, and then she rode with him to the hospital, and she sat in that waiting room for 4 hours until the doctor came out and told her that Charles Blackwell had suffered a serious cardiac episode. but that he had survived, and that the speed of the response had almost certainly saved his life. The family arrived the following morning. There were tears and relieved embraces, and words of gratitude directed at the hospital staff. The cardiologist received warm handshakes and praise. Someone even thanked fate. Clara stood near the back of the waiting room with her coat still on. Nobody called her name. Nobody pulled her aside. Nobody said, "Clara, thank you." Because in their minds, Clara had simply been doing what she was paid to do. She was the help. And the help did not require gratitude. Charles, however, was not asleep when this happened. He saw his family arrive. He saw the handshakes and the tears. He watched Derek smile at a doctor he had never met before and say, "Thank goodness you were here." And then, from across the room, he found Clara, standing quietly near the exit. Her eyes met his for just a moment. She gave a small nod. He nodded back. And something passed between them that no one else in that room even noticed. 3 weeks after leaving the hospital, Charles began reviewing his estate documents with new eyes. He went through every account, every investment portfolio, every inheritance plan that had been carefully structured by lawyers over the previous 2 decades. He also began paying much closer attention to what was happening in his own home. And the more he watched, the more troubled he became. His children had already begun making quiet inquiries. Derek had called the family lawyer twice. Vanessa had mentioned, casually at dinner, that it might be wise to transfer certain assets before capital gains laws changed. Tyler had begun photographing the artwork. Charles said nothing, but he recorded everything. He kept a private journal. He installed a small, unobtrusive camera in his study, the kind used for home security. And one evening, about 6 weeks after returning home from the hospital, he said something to Clara that stopped her in the middle of collecting his dinner dishes. She remembers every word. She has replayed it 1,000 times since. He looked up from his reading chair, not dramatically, not like a man delivering a speech, just a tired old man who was finally saying something honest, and he said, "Clara, I've been thinking about what happens to a man's legacy when the people he leaves it to have never once had to earn anything." She stood there holding a dinner plate, not sure whether she was supposed to answer. So she simply said, "I think that depends on what you leave behind, Mr. Blackwell." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "If the day comes when nobody believes the truth, promise me you'll remember." She told him she would. At the time she assumed it was the late hour and the medication talking. A lonely man reflecting on his mortality. She did not understand that it was something far more deliberate. That understanding would not arrive for another 7 months. Because 7 months later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, Charles called her into his private study. He opened the top drawer of his oak desk. He placed a small brass key in her palm. And he said just 4 more words. "Keep this. Trust no one." Then he closed her fingers around it. And that was all. If you're still following the story, drop "One key changes everything" in the comments below, because what happens next is something nobody in that mansion saw coming. And before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click the subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Think about that for a moment. A man worth hundreds of millions of dollars. A man with 3 adult children, a legal team, a board of directors, and decades of carefully constructed plans. And the one person he chose to trust with a key that nobody else on earth knew existed was a woman who cleaned his kitchen every morning at 6 o'clock. Ask yourself, what does it take to earn that kind of trust? Not money. Not blood. Not a shared last name. Think about every person in your own life who has shown up for you quietly, consistently, without needing recognition. Have you ever truly seen them? Have you ever told them what they mean to you before it was too late? 2 years passed after that Sunday afternoon in the study. Clara kept the key in a small envelope inside the lining of her winter coat. She told no one. Not her daughter in Tennessee. Not her sister in Louisville. Not a single soul. Life at the manor continued as it always had. The work was the same. The dynamics were the same. The cold dismissals and the invisible treatment from the Blackwell children continued unchanged. What had changed was only invisible to everyone except Clara. She now understood that she held something. She just didn't know what. And Charles, for his part, gave her no further explanation. He simply treated her with the same quiet respect he always had. No special treatment. No knowing glances. Nothing that might alert anyone else. Just the ordinary rhythm of a life that contained, somewhere beneath its surface, an extraordinary secret. Then, in the winter of 2016, Charles Blackwell's health began a serious and rapid decline. The cardiac episode had weakened his heart more than anyone had admitted publicly. He developed complications. He spent weeks in and out of hospitals. He lost weight. He became frail in a way that was painful to watch, especially for Clara, who had observed him for over 2 decades at his most powerful and self-assured. The family gathered more frequently at the manor now. Not out of tenderness, Clara noticed, but out of proximity to the process, to the lawyers, to the accountants, to the decisions that would soon need to be made. The conversations she overheard through doorways and hallways were not about their father's comfort. They were about assets, about timing, about who had spoken to the legal team most recently. One evening, she passed the closed door of the east sitting room and heard Vanessa say, "Clear as day, if Tyler gets the Connecticut properties, I'm contesting the entire filing." Clara kept walking. She set a tea tray outside the door and said nothing to anyone. Charles passed away on a Tuesday morning in March of 2017. He was 81 years old. The news spread quickly. Tributes flooded in from business contacts across the country. Former executives spoke warmly about his vision. Local newspapers ran front-page stories about his philanthropy. For 3 days, Blackwell Manor was full of people in dark clothing with careful expressions. Clara worked through all of it. She cooked. She cleaned. She greeted guests at the door and refilled water glasses and remained, as she always had, invisible. And on the 3rd evening, when the last visitor had left and the house was quiet, she sat alone in the kitchen and allowed herself to cry for the first time. Not for the key. Not for whatever secret she had been entrusted with. She cried because he had been a decent man. Flawed, like all men. Sometimes absent in ways that mattered. Sometimes blind to things he should have seen. But in the years after that hospital night, he had become, quietly and without announcement, the most consistent source of genuine respect she had experienced in that house. And now he was gone. The family moved quickly after the funeral. Lawyers appeared within 48 hours. Documents were produced and reviewed. Assets were inventoried. The mood in the house shifted in a way Clara could feel physically. It was like the temperature dropped several degrees. Derek took command of the dining room table as if it were a boardroom. Vanessa arrived with her own attorney, which immediately created tension with the estate lawyers. Tyler oscillated between silent and loud, first agreeable, then suspicious, then confrontational. Within a week, it was clear that whatever goodwill the family had maintained during the funeral period was dissolving fast. And then, on a Monday afternoon exactly 10 days after Charles's death, the lead attorney, a careful and measured man named Gerald Holt, called the family together in the formal sitting room. Clara was asked to serve coffee. She stood near the doorway unseen, as she always was. Gerald Holt cleared his throat. He placed a folder on the coffee table. He said that in addition to the standard estate documents, Charles had left a final sealed instruction. That this instruction was binding. And that the inheritance process could not be completed, could not legally proceed, until a specific item was retrieved. A specific vault. And a specific key. That key, according to the sealed instructions signed by Charles Blackwell himself and witnessed by 2 independent attorneys, was in the possession of a woman named Clara Mitchell. The maid. The silence in that room lasted exactly 4 seconds. Clara counted them from the doorway. Then all 3 Blackwell children spoke at the same time. The accusations came fast and without hesitation. Derek stood up from his chair. He looked at Clara directly for possibly the first time in 23 years, not through her, but at her, and what was on his face was not recognition or gratitude. It was fury. "This is a manipulation," he said. "This woman has been in this house for years. She had access to everything. She had access to him when he was medicated and confused." Vanessa was already on her phone, calling her attorney. Tyler kept repeating the word impossible, quietly, almost to himself, as if saying it enough times might change the facts. Gerald Holt waited for the noise to subside. Then he produced the documentation. Charles's signature. 2 witness signatures. A notary seal. The date. Signed and certified 8 months after the cardiac episode, during a period when every medical record confirmed Charles Blackwell was in full cognitive health. The family had no legal ground. The key belonged to Clara. They had no choice. Can you imagine standing in that room? After 23 years of being treated as invisible. After 2 decades of yes, Mrs. Blackwell and I apologize and small nods in dimly lit hallways. Can you imagine being the woman standing in the doorway holding a serving tray when your name is suddenly the most important name in the room? Because that is exactly where Clara Mitchell stood. And she did not gloat. She did not say a word. She simply set the coffee tray down carefully on the sideboard, reached into the pocket of her uniform, and placed the small brass key on the table in front of Gerald Holt. Her hand was steady. 2 hours later, they gathered in the library. All 3 Blackwell children, 2 attorneys, a notary, and Clara. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with books. Charles had been a genuine reader. Clara had dusted those shelves for over 2 decades. She knew every row. She knew exactly which section of the east wall, behind a shelf holding a collection of first edition American novels, concealed a door that she had noticed years ago, but had never once touched. Gerald Holt moved the shelf aside on its hidden rail. Behind it was a steel door, roughly 2 feet wide. Matte gray. No external markings. A single keyhole. Clara stepped forward. She placed the small brass key in the lock. She turned it. The mechanism shifted with a deep, precise click. And the door opened. Inside the vault there were no stacks of currency. No jewels in velvet cases. What was inside was something far more powerful than money. There were files. Organized, labeled, dated files going back nearly a decade. There were 2 sealed envelopes addressed to Gerald Holt. There was a notebook with handwritten entries in Charles's careful script. And on a small digital player, connected to a monitor that hummed quietly to life when the vault door opened, there was a video. Recorded. Waiting. Gerald Holt pressed play. Charles Blackwell appeared on the screen. Older than most people in the room had seen him recently. But composed. Deliberate. He looked directly into the camera with the calm authority of a man who has already made peace with his decision and has nothing left to prove. He spoke for 11 minutes. What he said dismantled everything the family believed they were about to inherit. He began by addressing his children by name. He told them he loved them. He said that clearly and without qualification. Then he said something that made Tyler look at the floor and Vanessa go completely still. He said, "I watched what you became, and I watched myself allow it. That is my failure as much as yours. I gave you everything and taught you to value nothing." He described years of financial misconduct he had quietly documented. Payments made to suppress legal issues Derek had caused. A pattern of manipulation Vanessa had used against 2 former business partners, one of whom had been driven to bankruptcy. A series of fraudulent insurance claims connected to Tyler that Charles had personally covered up out of what he called, on camera, the worst kind of parental cowardice. And then he said the words that made the room go silent in a different way. A permanent, total silence. He said, "I am not leaving my estate to you. Not because I stopped loving you, but because I no longer trust you with what I spent my life building." The files in the vault contained documentation of all of it. Every incident. Every cover-up. Every private transaction. Given now to Gerald Holt and, through him, to the appropriate authorities where legally required. As for the estate itself, the terms were outlined in the sealed documents. The companies would be placed in a managed trust with an independent board. A substantial fund would be established for scholarships targeting first-generation college students across 4 states. A medical wing at the county hospital, which Charles had long promised to fund, would finally be constructed. A portion would support housing programs for widows and single mothers in financial hardship. A program, Clara noticed, that shared a great deal of its eligibility criteria with her own life story from 23 years ago. And at the center of all of it, named as the individual responsible for overseeing the transition and ensuring that Charles's final wishes were executed with integrity, was Clara Mitchell. Not as a beneficiary, as a trustee. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. The family contested, of course. Derek hired a legal team within days. Vanessa released a statement to the press suggesting that her father had been manipulated by a domestic employee with access to a vulnerable man. Tyler gave one interview in which he described the situation as a tragedy and then stopped speaking to reporters altogether. The legal contest dragged on for months. Clara never responded publicly. She continued living in her small home in the same neighborhood she had lived in for 20 years. She continued cooking her own meals and watching her favorite evening programs and calling her daughter in Tennessee on Sunday afternoons. She had always known who she was. She did not need a court ruling to tell her. What the courts ultimately confirmed was what Gerald Holt had said from the very beginning. The documentation was airtight. Charles Blackwell's mental capacity at the time of signing was unquestionable. His wishes were clear, specific, and legally binding. One by one, the family's legal challenges were dismissed. 14 months after Charles's death, the transition process formally began. Scholarships were awarded to the first class of recipients. Clara sat in the back row at the small ceremony and watched a 20-year-old girl from rural Ohio stand up and say thank you into a microphone, her voice cracking with the weight of a door that had just opened for her. Clara clasped her hands in her lap and breathed slowly and thought about her own daughter at that age, and about James, and about the cold November morning she had first walked through those iron gates. 14 months was a long time. 23 years was even longer. And yet here she was. The medical wing broke ground in the spring. Clara attended the ceremony at the hospital. She wore a gray coat and sensible shoes. She stood near the back. The hospital administrator gave a speech. He mentioned Charles's name many times and once, briefly, mentioned the trust. He did not mention Clara by name. She had asked him not to. Afterward, a young nurse who had been assigned to the cardiac unit stopped her near the parking lot. The nurse said, "Are you the woman from the Blackwell estate?" Clara said yes. The nurse said, "My mother had a cardiac episode 2 years ago. She couldn't afford the follow-up care. She's going to be one of the first patients to benefit from this unit." She had tears in her eyes. Clara told her she was glad. She meant it completely. One afternoon in early autumn, exactly 2 years after Charles's death, Clara drove out to the cemetery where he was buried. She went alone. No cameras. No lawyers. No reporters who had occasionally tried to reach her for interviews she never gave. She parked her car and walked across the grass in the quiet afternoon light. She placed a small bundle of white chrysanthemums against his headstone. She stood there for a few minutes without speaking. She thought about the man who had built an empire and in his final years quietly grieved what it had cost him. She thought about a conversation they had once had over coffee at the kitchen table, one of those late evenings when the rest of the house was empty and he had allowed himself, briefly, to sound like the dock worker's son from Baltimore instead of a billionaire. He had said to her, "I sometimes wonder what I might have become if I'd had less money and more time to think." She had told him, "You can still think, Mr. Blackwell. The time is still yours." He had smiled at that. The kind of smile that meant he was genuinely pleased by something. She had thought about that smile many times since. She thought about it now, standing at his grave in the autumn light. There is a real story behind what you just heard. In 1927, a German immigrant named Rosa worked faithfully for a wealthy American shipbuilder for 30 years. When he died, he gave her everything. His family contested. His family lost. Because what he had understood, after 3 decades of watching, was that the person who shows up every day without reward, who maintains their dignity without an audience, who treats their work as meaningful even when no one is watching, that person is worth more than any name on a family tree. Rosa's story was recorded in a newspaper in February of 1927 and mostly forgotten. But the principle at the heart of it has never become outdated. Loyalty is not obligated by blood. Trust is not transferred through inheritance. And the person everyone overlooks is very often the one who most clearly sees the truth. So let's talk about this honestly. Because this story is not just about a maid and a billionaire. It's about something most of us have experienced in some form. Have you ever been the Clara in a situation? The person who did the work, held the line, kept the quiet dignity while people around you took credit or offered condescension. Maybe it wasn't a mansion. Maybe it was an office. A family gathering. A relationship. A job where you gave everything and felt entirely unseen. If that resonates with you, tell us in the comments. Because you are not alone. And this story exists to remind you that being overlooked is not the same as being unimportant. And here is the other side of it. Think about the people in your own life who are quietly, consistently showing up for you. The ones who do it without making speeches or demanding recognition. The ones who check on you. Who remember the small things. Who are still there after everyone else has left. When did you last tell them what they mean to you? Because Charles Blackwell waited until he was writing a document in a vault to say what he should have said out loud, years earlier, in a kitchen over a cup of tea. Don't make that mistake. The people who truly deserve your trust are usually the ones who have never once asked for anything beyond the basic dignity of being seen. Did Charles make the right decision? Should family always come first simply because it's family? Or does trust need to be earned, regardless of whose last name you share? Some people will say he was wrong. That blood should have counted for something. Others will say that his children forfeited any claim to trust through their own behavior. There is no clean answer. But ask yourself honestly, if you had watched the people around you behave the way the Blackwell children behaved, and if you had watched one quiet, loyal person show up day after day for 23 years, what would you have done? Share your answer in the comments below. We read every single one. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you pick up your phone and text someone you've been meaning to reach out to, then it did exactly what it was meant to do. Subscribe for more stories like this one. Stories about hidden truths, unexpected justice, and the quiet kind of courage that doesn't make headlines but changes everything. Because sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the one holding the key to everything. And our next story may be even harder to believe.